So, doubt. We've given doubt almost the level when I was growing up in Sunday school, uh, and for those of you who never did the Sunday school thing, I grew up in church, and almost everybody went to Sunday school. The adults went to Sunday school, the children went to Sunday school, or else the adults taught Sunday school, but they were in one of those two places when I grew up. That was pretty much it. And I'm not sure it was ever said to me directly, but the implication I got out of Sunday school growing up was that doubt was a bad thing. We called Doubting Thomas because it was a denigration of his person. Don't be, oh, you're a doubting Thomas. Don't be a doubting Thomas. And so I spent a lifetime worrying every time I doubted something. It's almost like don't ever read a religious book, don't ever read a commentary on the Bible, because it might challenge you about what you already think is true. And your world will stay awfully small. It'll be very manageable. And guess what? Your God will stay awfully small and really manageable. You have a neat little box. You might be able to fit him right into this little package right here. You could carry it around, open it up. Oh, look, there's God. Isn't that neat? But then that would really mess too with your idea that God is infinite, that God is everywhere all the time. If God fits neatly into a box I can even understand, if God can even completely fit in the word God. You know what's interesting? All the way up through Middle English, God was spelled with a little g, even in the Bible. It was in late English, the one we're stuck with now, where we capitalized G as if it was a proper name. God is not God's name. God is a word that points to something so big, so mysterious, so ultimate, so infinite, you can't capture it. Certainly not with 3 letters in the English alphabet. Certainly not. God is so much bigger than that. But in order to get to that place, we have to start with a neat, manageable God. That's the way development works. When we're little kids, we need a neat, manageable God. So if you notice, I noticed it in Sunday school, but if you notice when we're telling children's stories about God and the biblical stories, we clean them up a little bit. I never thought about anybody dying in Noah's Ark. Any of the people who weren't in Noah's Ark dying, everything focused when I was in Sunday school completely on the guys and gals in the boat, as well as 2 of every kind of animal. We focused on the good stuff. Because children, that's just massive. It's terrible when you start thinking about that massive kind of death. It's too much for little children to absorb, so we clean it up a little bit for them. But the problem is then we get stuck with the cleaned up versions in our head. And our God never gets bigger than that. We clean God up so he's neat. And we're sure he's a he. So we keep God really, really neatly packaged. And if anybody challenges that, boy, we'll get into a mean argument with them. We will take them down a notch. It won't sound like we've ever even heard about love. You challenge my take on God, I am going to take your knees out from under you. I am going to argue you into the ground. I'm going to show you how right I am. Because you dared to question the things I am sure is true. And this is where the problem is. Faith is not the same thing as certainty. In fact, certainty is the opposite of faith. It's the opposite of faith. Faith is that leap into the unknown. It's that relationship that is kind of unpredictable. When have you ever had a relationship in your life that you totally knew every time someone opened their mouth exactly what they were going to say? Linda surprises me all the time. Oftentimes she surprises me by saying something I was already thinking. And I'm like, oh dear, are we on an old, Do we look alike? Can we sit next to each other and you could say, oh, yes, they do. They look a lot. We could show a picture before we got married, a picture after we got married. James looks exactly like Linda. His hair's just a little shorter. That would be bad. So we have to worry that we are worshiping the idol of certainty and not jumping into the journey of faith, the faith that God wants us to have, the relationship. Thomas is a person I want to not only admire, he's the author of my faith. Oh, yes, below Thomas is God. The ground of my faith is God. I'm not saying below Thomas. Thomas ranks above. I'm saying the very ground of my faith is God and Jesus Christ and the Spirit that flows everywhere. Yes, that's the ground. That's the farthest ground. But somebody who could doubt and ask questions, I needed him in the 20s, when I was in my 20s. I needed him. I needed Thomas to be in the story and still be considered an okay guy on the far side. Because my whole 20s were fraught with doubt and struggle, as all the things I assumed God would take care of for me stopped being taken care of, at least the way I wanted them to be taken care of. My God, who was my divine butler, Jeeves, or God, could you pick up my coat? Could you make sure I have a perfect job and get just the right amount of money and everything is great? That I can live high off the hog? Yes. When that didn't happen, when things came apart for me in my 20s, what I needed was someone like Thomas who's unafraid to ask questions. You should be thankful for Thomas, like I'm thankful for Thomas. It was Thomas in John chapter 14. Just a reminder, if you want to go back and look at it yourself, you can. Jesus said, I'm headed off. I'm going to a place. You know where I'm going. And Thomas was like, Jesus, we don't know where you're going, so we don't know how to get there. Do you know how much courage it must have taken? Jesus has stated, you all know where I'm going, you know what I'm about. And Thomas said, oh, no, we do not. We need somebody like Thomas to ask the question, because you know what comes out of that question? Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am. We would never have gotten that if Thomas had not asked that question. And courageously, Thomas is going to ask another question. So that was a long precursor to hear what Thomas has to say to us today, or at least to hear the scripture. This is a powerful text as far as I'm concerned. Whatever. We are picking up in chapter 20. 2 weeks ago, we read chapter 21 through 18, which is the resurrection story as told by Mary Magdalene. Now we jump ahead from verse 18 to verse 24. Jesus has made an appearance to the 10. Thomas was somewhere else. I always like to think of him, he was like running an errand. Maybe he had to run to 7-Eleven. They ran out of milk in the house. They were hanging out. I don't know where he was, but he wasn't there. The one guy that wasn't there. And so this is where it picks up. Thomas, the one called Didymus, which means twin, one of the 12, wasn't with the disciples when Jesus appeared. The other disciples told him, we've seen the Lord. He replied, unless I see the nail marks in his hands, put my finger in the wounds left by the nails, and put my hand into his side, I won't believe. So, new paragraph. After 8 days, Jesus' disciples were again in a house, and Thomas was with them. Even though the doors were locked, Jesus entered and stood among them. He said, peace be with you. Then he said to Thomas, put your fingers here. Look at my hands. Put your hand into my side. No more disbelief. Believe. Thomas responded to Jesus, my Lord and my God. Jesus replied, do you believe because you see me? Blessed are those who don't see and yet believe. This is the gospel for this morning. Praise be to God. So, it's a couple of important things to take note of. First of all, we want to point to Thomas as the doubter. The other 10 male disciples were just as doubtful as Thomas. Mary Magdalene comes back and reports to him, I've seen the Lord. He's risen. He's alive. And what do the disciples do? Poo-poo it. Poo-poo it. They ignore it. What did we read last week? The story of the disciples to the road to Emmaus. The disciples have taken off on the road, and they're talking to Jesus without knowing it's Jesus. And they say, the women came and told us he was risen. And, everybody else ran back to look, but didn't see anything but an empty tomb. So we don't know what to do. We don't know what to do. The other 10 disciples, just as disbelieving as Thomas, just Thomas wasn't there for the first appearance. 8 days later, now remember, 8 is an important number. You may not know it, but all sorts of numbers in the Bible are very powerful symbols. 7, how many days of the week are there? 7. 7th is a complete week. 7 is a holy number. 8 is the promise of a fulfilled future. 8 is fulfillment. On the 8th day, on fulfillment time, Jesus appears again to the disciples. Peace be with you. Thomas, go ahead, touch me. Put your hands into my fingers. Put your fingers into my hands. Put your hand into my side. Yeah. I still have the scars, resurrected with scars. That's a sermon for another time. And then Thomas believes. And then you and I get an amazing blessing. Jesus says to Thomas, you saw and believed. How blessed are those who don't see and still believe. That's us. That's us. That's all of us. That's everyone for the last 2,000 years. That's us. Yes, they've seen visions of Jesus. Paul did, but he didn't see Jesus in the flesh. He saw a vision of Jesus. Others have seen visions of Jesus. I feel like I have seen Christ in lots of folks, but I have not seen Jesus. And yet, Jesus saw fit because Thomas asked to bless people who believed and never saw. There's another lesson I think is very important for you to hear here. You know how I say to you on a regular basis, you are infinitely precious and unconditionally loved for the gift you already are. Each of you is. How many people in the story I just read to you, how many people doubted? At this point in the story, 1, Thomas. And how many people did it take for Jesus to show up? Doubting. 1. Every one of us is that important to God. Every one of us is that important. It took 1. You don't think God listens to you, but maybe if you could get some really righteous people together, God would listen to you? No. God cares about even the 1. For Thomas, Jesus showed up. For Thomas. First to Mary, the first evangelist, the first one to proclaim the good news, Mary Magdalene, and then to the 10, and then for the 1. For the 1. For you and for me. How blessed are we that we believe? But let me also say something that I think we need to, I want you to model your life after Jesus. Okay, primary model. Secondary model, Thomas. Admit you have questions. Admit you have questions. And don't be... We live in a society now, and this is one of the things that concerns me most about the world we live in, is I can, if I choose to, only read the things that agree with me for the rest of my life. And never be challenged by a different point of view. Never be challenged. Sadly for me, it's too late. I have read so widely and so much that everything that I held as my Sunday school little guy, I still hold. But it got bigger. The box broke, and God got out. Oh my gosh, where's God now? Everywhere. So much bigger than the box I wanted to put God in. The challenge for us is we're afraid to learn anything different than what we already know. And if somebody tells us something different than we already know, we are ready to fight them to the death. There may be no knives involved, but watch C-SPAN for a little while on the floor of the House. It seems like that, if you have a D after your name or an R after your name, the R or the D, you're ready to take on the other ones. The D's are ready to take out the R's, and the R's are ready to kill the D's. Same thing. I'm not saying one's better than the other. I have thoughts, yes, my personal opinion, but the truth of the thing is, we are afraid of ideas different than ours. We're starting to ban books because we're afraid somebody might be exposed to a different reality. Being exposed to a different reality does not make you a different person. It just exposes you to different stories. And you can say, that story is not mine. I am absolutely sure the story I have right now is mine. I want to tell you, this may be heretical. I may never see any of you again because of this. But one of the ways I came to understand Jesus and appreciate him more was by reading in other religious traditions. I read the Tao Te Ching. I still read the Tao Te Ching periodically. And what I hear in it is not the truth I learned in here. And so I can push back on the things that are different. And it can reinforce for me what I know. But sometimes it also can stretch me. From the very first section of the Tao Te Ching, it could have come from the Bible almost. It says, the name that can be named is not the eternal name. So if you can say God, and that names everything there is to name about God, it's not the eternal God. It's the God you've made in your mind. That's the beginning of the Tao Te Ching. I read that and I thought, that's pretty much what the Bible says in some ways. I'm not going to become a Taoist. But it doesn't matter that I stretched a little bit, because the stretching actually helped me appreciate this text more. The questioning, the doubting is an invitation, and it takes, as it did with Thomas, and it will with you, it certainly did with me, courage. To ask questions of the faith that you have neatly packaged is hard work. You know why? Because you don't want to mess with that package. I don't want to mess with that package. I don't want to mess with yours. But I want to invite you to be willing to let God mess with the package that you've created. Because certainty is not faith. We don't measure our faith by percentages. Well, you're about 50% faithful because you're 50% certain. And, I actually heard Father Greg Boyle say this. You're about 50% certain that's good enough to get into heaven. You're about 80% sure, well, maybe you could heal some things like, sprained ankles or headaches. 90% sure, oh my goodness, what might you be able to do then? 100% sure, you can literally move mountains. You can walk out to the Blue Ridge and say, I need you to move about 50 feet over there. but only if you're 100%. And by the way, if you're 100% sure, absolutely, you'll get healed from whatever disease you have. You can 100% sure. And if you're not 100% sure and you're not healed, it's your fault. Not God's, it's yours. Well, that's messed up. I'm sorry, that measurement is messed up. Faith is a relationship. It's not a percentage. I'm not in a relationship with Linda 51% or 91%. I'm in a relationship with Linda. I'm either in or I'm out. I'm engaged in this. Sometimes it surprises me. Sometimes it challenges me. Sometimes it pushes me. Sometimes it frustrates me. And sometimes it gives me great joy. And Linda probably feels the exact same way, maybe at different times. At least I hope she feels that whole range, including joy. Same thing as with God. There are moments after I finish my morning sit and prayer time when I just feel like God is so close, it's like I'm swimming in God. And I'm like, this is a perfect day. I can already feel it. This is perfect. Tomorrow, I sit and I sit and I pray and I pray and I sit again and I pray again and I read 16 different books. And believe me, if you've been in my office, you know that there's a lot of choices. I pull all the books off the shelf because this one's going to be the magical one. Pull the Bible. I pull, oh, well, maybe it wasn't the Jerusalem version. I should use the New American version. Oh, no, I'm going to pull the... Yeah, there's some kind of magic that'll get me out of this spot. And you know what happens? Nothing. It's a bad day. You have good days and bad days in faith. It's a relationship. I feel maybe a little less certain on the days when, but certainty is not a piece of my faith. Doubt is. Asking questions is. I want you to read the Bible. Take this week, read the whole thing. If you know anything about the Bible, if you can read it in the whole week, that's pretty miraculous. But read it. You'll find there's a lot of questions in there, and a lot of them are never answered. There's a lot of questions in there that are never answered. You know, because they're that good. Maybe a couple of your questions will never get answered either. Maybe more than a couple. I've got a couple I'm waiting for God to kind of like pull out the book and say, all right, James, it's time. I can reveal this to you. Here you go. God hasn't done it yet. I don't know if God ever will. But my relationship is okay with me asking that question because it stretches me and builds our relationship. If Linda and I had never had our relationship tested, I don't know if we'd made it to 32 years because we had to come through those crucibles of test as well as all the joyous times. And it turns out we have a lot more joyous times than we had tests, which is probably why we could still be hanging together after 32 years. Most of my life has been pretty joyous with God, but there's been some pretty not so good times. And God never left me. Just felt like God did. It just felt like God did. So ask your questions. Have your doubts. Bring them to God. Struggle with them. Because maybe God is trying to help you break out of the box where you have put God into the neat little poster that you can hang on your wall and always look at and be comfortable with. And God needs you to be stretched a little bit outside your comfort zone because that's how faith grows. It's how a relationship grows. Getting a little stretched. I don't know if I can do that. Well, try. Try. So, if you're a doubter, 2 thumbs up. If you're not a doubter, 2 thumbs up. If you have problems with doubters and you judge them, 2 thumbs down. That's not our job. Ask good questions. Enter into a good relationship with God. Because that's all that God hopes for you. That you'll learn to love and be loved just for you.